Now, hold that feeling. Because everything you just imagined, that certainty, that king, that kingdom, those bells, is about to disappear. This is the story of a world that existed before China became China. A world most people never picture when they hear the word ancient. A world made not of one emperor and one throne, but of dozens of kingdoms, thousands of dialects, millions of ordinary lives, farmers and blacksmiths and merchants and mothers and soldiers who woke up every morning inside a civilization so fragmented, so alive, so endlessly contested, that calling it by a single name almost seems like a lie. Before there was one China, there were many. Before there was one emperor, there were many kings. Before there was one law, there were hundreds of traditions. And the people who lived inside all of this, the people who planted rice and paid tribute and raised children and watched armies pass through their fields, they had no idea that what they were living was the last chapter of something ancient. They only knew the world they had. What we're going to explore in this documentary is that world. Not the world of generals and dynasties, not the world of dates and battles, but the world of people. What did a street look like? What did a family eat? How did you greet your neighbors? What did you fear? What did you believe would protect you? And most importantly, what did it feel like to live inside a civilization that was, without anyone knowing it yet, about to be erased and reborn as something entirely different? The period we're talking about is the Warring States period, roughly between 475 BCE and 221 BCE, nearly 2.5 centuries during which 7 major kingdoms fought, negotiated, schemed, and bled against each other across the territory we now call China. But before those wars had their names, before history gave those centuries their label, people simply lived. They simply woke up and worked and ate and slept and worried and hoped. Let's begin there. Before the first walls of the Warring States were built, before the great philosophers walked the roads trying to convince kings to listen to reason, the world of ancient China was already impossibly old. The Zhou dynasty had ruled, or at least claimed to rule, for centuries. The Zhou king sat in his capital and performed the sacred rituals that connected heaven to earth, that connected the living to the ancestors, that held the cosmic order in place. But the Zhou king's power had been draining away for generations, quietly, like water disappearing into dry soil. By the time the Warring States period begins in earnest, the Zhou king is more of a sacred symbol than a ruler. He exists, he performs ceremonies, he grants titles, but his words no longer move armies. His commands no longer change borders. The real power belongs to the lords of the great states, Qin, Chu, Qi, Wei, Zhao, Han, Yan. Each of them rulers of territories so vast, so populated, so internally complex, that they might as well have been separate countries, because they were. And this is where the story of ordinary life becomes fascinating and strange and deeply human. Imagine walking from one of these kingdoms into another. Today we might cross a national border and notice a change in language, in signs, in currency. In ancient China during the Warring States period, crossing from one kingdom to another meant crossing into a different reality. The dialect might be so different that you couldn't be understood. The customs could be entirely foreign. The way people dressed, the gods they honored at roadside shrines, the foods they considered sacred or taboo, all of it could shift simply by walking 2 days down a road. This was not one civilization experiencing one story. This was dozens of civilizations sharing a geography. Let's go deeper into the life of ordinary people, because this is where the real texture of the world comes alive. In the kingdoms of ancient China before unification, the majority of people were farmers, not in any romantic sense. Not in the way paintings might later idealize the peasant working peacefully in a green field with mountains behind him. Real farming in this era was brutal, exhausting, and precarious in ways that are difficult to fully grasp from the distance of modern life. The agricultural calendar was a kind of god. It commanded everything. Planting season, harvest season, the flooding of rivers, the failure of rains. These were not inconveniences. They were questions of survival. Families who failed to produce enough grain didn't just go hungry. They fell into debt. And debt, in this world, had terrible consequences. A family that couldn't pay its obligations to a local lord could lose its land. Worse, family members could be taken as bondservants, a form of servitude that sat just at the edge of slavery, and from which it was almost impossible to recover. The crops themselves tell a story. In the north, in the Great Plains of what would become the heartland of Chinese civilization, people grew millet. Millet was the ancient grain, the grain of survival, the grain that could endure drought better than almost anything else. It was boiled into porridge, dried and stored, ground into rough flour. The smell of millet cooking was probably the most universal smell of daily life across the northern kingdoms. Farmers knew millet the way we know bread, as something so basic it becomes invisible. In the south, particularly in the vast territories of the Kingdom of Chu, which stretched across regions we now call Hunan, Hubei, and beyond, rice was beginning its long rise as the dominant crop. Wet rice cultivation required something millet farming did not: water management, paddies, irrigation channels, cooperation between communities to build and maintain systems that no single family could manage alone. This meant that in the southern kingdoms, village life had a different character, a different kind of interdependence, a different relationship to the landscape. And then there were the fish. The rivers and lakes of ancient China were a food source so significant that they shaped settlement patterns, trade routes, and diets across entire regions. People who lived near water ate very differently from people who lived in the dry interior. The Kingdom of Chu had a reputation, even among the other kingdoms, for cooking that was rich, complex, spiced in ways that northerners found excessive. There is actually surviving poetry from this period. The Chu Chi, the Songs of Chu, that describes food in extraordinary detail: steamed turtle, braised pork, soups of fragrant herbs, roasted meats glazed with sauces. Even in poetry, the people of Chu were thinking about what was on the table. But most people were not eating braised pork. Most people were eating what they could grow, what they could afford to keep after tribute was paid, what survived the winter in clay storage pots buried in the ground. The average farmer's daily diet was simple to the point of austerity: grain porridge, dried vegetables, fermented soybeans, which were ancient China's answer to the need for protein when meat was unavailable, which was most of the time. Occasionally, a small fish from a nearby stream. Salt, which was precious, traded, taxed, and sometimes worth more than the food it seasoned. Salt is worth pausing on for a moment, because it reveals something important about how this world worked. Salt production in ancient China was a state matter. The great salt flats along the coast and certain inland regions were controlled by lords who understood that salt was not just a seasoning. It was the only preservative available on any meaningful scale. Without salt, meat spoiled. Without salt, fish couldn't be dried for the winter. Without salt, survival through the cold months became considerably harder. Kingdoms that controlled salt sources had leverage over kingdoms that didn't. The trade in salt moved along specific roads, guarded by specific officials, taxed at specific checkpoints. For an ordinary farmer, buying salt meant navigating a system of commerce and tribute that reached all the way up to the lords and kings above him. This is how most people experience the political world, not through grand speeches or military campaigns, but through prices, through the cost of salt, the weight of the grain tax, the number of days each year they were required to provide labor to their lord's projects. It was in these daily calculations. Can we afford this? Will there be enough left for winter? Can the children eat? That the reality of the political system pressed down most heavily on ordinary lives. The houses people lived in reflected the extreme stratification of this world. In the great cities, which were real cities, walled, populated, commercially active in ways that would surprise anyone who imagines ancient China as uniformly rural. The wealthy merchant or minor official might live in a compound of wooden buildings arranged around a central courtyard. Walls separated the family from the street. The courtyard held a tree or a small garden, or perhaps a well. The buildings were organized by function and by hierarchy. The main hall where guests were received. The inner quarters where women of the household lived in a protected seclusion that was simultaneously a privilege and a confinement. The courtyard house was not just architecture. It was a social philosophy made out of wood and tile. The placement of rooms reflected the structure of the family. The eldest male sat at the position of greatest honor at the table. Sons took their places in order of age. Women and daughters occupied the inner spaces, visible to the family but not to the street. Guests were received with rituals of greeting that varied by social rank. How low you bowed, how you held your hands, what words you used to address. Someone depended entirely on where you both stood in a system of relationships so detailed, so elaborated, that it required years of education to master fully. And that system had a name. Even then, even before Confucius had become the towering figure history would make him into, the name was Li. Ritual propriety. The correct way of doing everything. The understanding that every human interaction, from a state banquet to a conversation between neighbors, had a proper form, a proper sequence, a proper emotional register. To violate Li was not just rude. It was a kind of cosmic disorder. It was the small human equivalent of the seasons arriving out of order. Most people, of course, could not fully master Li in its elaborate courtly form, but they understood its basic grammar. They knew that you brought a gift when you visited someone's home for the first time. They knew that you addressed your father's brother differently from your mother's brother. They knew that the dead required offerings, that ancestors watched the living and could intervene in their affairs for good or for ill, that the ceremonies of mourning, the white clothing, the wailing, the specific foods left at the graveside, were not optional expressions of grief, but obligations that held the community together and kept the unseen world in its proper relationship to this one. The ancestors were not metaphorical. They were understood as genuinely present, genuinely interested, genuinely capable of blessing or punishing their descendants. A family's ancestral shrine, even a poor family's shrine, which might be nothing more than a small shelf with a clay tablet inscribed with the names of the dead, was the most sacred space in the home. Neglecting the ancestors was not merely impious. It was dangerous. It invited misfortune, and in a world where misfortune came so readily, in the form of drought or flood or disease or war, there was little tolerance for anything that might invite more of it. This relationship with the dead shaped how people thought about their own lives in ways that are difficult to fully translate into modern sensibility. You were not just yourself. You were the continuation of everyone who had come before you. Your successes honored the ancestors. Your failures shamed them. Your children were your greatest obligation to the family line. Sons especially, because without sons, there was no one to perform the ancestral rites, and without those rites, the dead became hungry, wandering, dangerous. The pressure this created on families, and particularly on women, was enormous and largely invisible in the historical record, but it structured virtually every decision about marriage, reproduction, and inheritance that a family made. Marriage in this world was almost never about love in the romantic sense. It was a negotiation between families, conducted through intermediaries, governed by considerations of social rank, economic compatibility, and astrological timing. The bride was brought to her husband's family home and effectively absorbed into it. She left her own family's surname behind and became a member of her husband's lineage. Her value to the family was measured primarily by her ability to produce sons. A woman who bore sons was honored. A woman who bore only daughters was pitied. A woman who bore no children at all lived a life of considerable anxiety and social precariousness. This is not to say that women had no agency, no inner life, no power. They absolutely did. The inner management of the household was almost entirely a female domain. The matriarch of a wealthy family could exercise considerable authority over servants, daughters-in-law, and the domestic economy. Widows with adult sons sometimes held significant real influence. And in the cultural sphere, in music, in poetry, in the weaving of silk, women's achievements were recognized and valued. But the structural conditions of their lives were severe, and the gap between the woman of the inner quarters and the woman of the fields was itself an index of how stratified this entire world was. Because we should not forget the woman of the fields. She worked beside her husband and her sons. She carried water and planted seedlings and harvested grain with her hands. There was no inner quarter for her. There was no seclusion. There was only work and the brief rest after work. And then more work. Her life was not organized by ritual propriety and ancestral shrines alone. It was organized by the weight of the basket on her back and the state of the coming harvest. Cities in this period were genuinely remarkable places, and this is one of the most underappreciated aspects of this world. The great cities of the Warring States, Linzi in Qi, Ying in Chu, Handan in Zhao, Shenyang in Qin, were not small towns. Archaeological evidence and historical texts together give us a picture of urban centers with populations in the hundreds of thousands, with neighborhoods organized by trade and craft, with markets that opened and closed according to official schedules, with walls so massive that their construction must have required years of organized labor. Linzi, the capital of the powerful state of Qi, was described by ancient sources as so densely populated that the carriages of its residents blocked the roads, and the sweat of pedestrians fell like rain. This is obviously rhetorical exaggeration, but it points to something real. These were cities with traffic problems, with crowding, with the noise and smell and energy of dense human habitation. The markets of these cities were not incidental. They were central. And the range of goods available in a major urban market of this period would genuinely surprise a visitor who expected the ancient world to be limited in its material culture. Bronze vessels of extraordinary artistry, silk cloth dyed in colors produced from plants and minerals that required sophisticated knowledge to extract, lacquerware, wooden objects coated in layer after layer of lacquer derived from the sap of the lacquer tree, then painted and polished to a depth and luster that rivals modern synthetic materials. Musical instruments, books, not yet paper, but texts written on strips of bamboo or silk, rolled and tied with cord, medicines derived from hundreds of plants, minerals, and animal products, sold by specialists who had inherited or apprenticed their way into a knowledge system of considerable complexity. The doctors of this period, the physicians who moved between cities and courts offering their services, were not charlatans in any simple sense. They worked within a framework of medical thought that was coherent, internally consistent, and based on centuries of observation, even if its underlying assumptions about the body were entirely different from modern biomedicine. They understood that the body contained pathways through which vital energy moved. They knew the importance of diet, of sleep, of emotional balance, of seasonal adjustment. They used acupuncture, the insertion of fine needles into specific points on the body, as a therapeutic tool, a practice that was already ancient by the Warring States period. They prescribed herbal compounds whose active ingredients we can, in many cases, verify today. The Yellow Emperor's Classic of Medicine, which codifies much of this knowledge, was compiled around this period or shortly after, but it describes a tradition that had already been accumulating for generations. And alongside the physicians, there were the diviners, the specialists in oracle bones, in turtle shells cracked by heat and read for messages from the spirit world, the specialists in the I Ching, the Book of Changes, who used yarrow stalks or coins to generate hexagrams that could reveal the hidden patterns of a situation and suggest the proper course of action. Divination was not fringe. It was not superstition in the way we use that word today, as something that exists alongside and in tension with rational knowledge. It was knowledge. It was the recognized method for accessing information that ordinary perception could not reach. Before making a major decision, before going to war, before signing a treaty, before building a new city, before naming an heir, rulers consulted diviners. Merchants consulted diviners before embarking on a long journey. Families consulted diviners before choosing a wedding date, before selecting a burial site, before beginning construction of a new home. The diviner occupied a position of genuine authority in this world because the diviner was understood to be accessing something real. And this points to one of the most important things to understand about daily life in this period. The boundary between the natural and the supernatural, between the physical world and the spirit world, was not where we would put it. The dead were present. Spirits inhabited rivers and mountains and particular trees. Demons could cause illness. Proper ritual could protect you. Improper conduct could invite disaster. The world was thoroughly animated, thoroughly inhabited by forces that required ongoing management, ongoing propitiation, ongoing attention. This is why the religious specialists, the shamans, the diviners, the ritual experts who knew exactly how to perform the ceremonies that kept these forces in proper relationship to the living were so important. And this is also why the great philosophical traditions of this period, Confucianism, Daoism, Legalism, Mohism, were not simply intellectual movements. They were competing answers to an urgent practical question. How should human beings organize their lives in a world this complex and this dangerous? The Confucians said, through ritual, through relationships, through the careful cultivation of virtue in oneself and one's social roles. The Taoists said, through yielding, through following the natural flow of things, through releasing the desperate human need to control and impose. The Mohists, and this is a tradition that history has treated harshly, burying it under the weight of Confucian dominance, said, through universal love, through practical benefit, through the rejection of the warfare and luxury that wasted human life and human resources. The legalists said, through law, through structure, through the systematic removal of sentiment from governance, through making rewards and punishment so clear and so consistent that human behavior could be managed like a machine. These were not abstract debates. They were arguments about how to survive, about how kingdoms could endure, how people could live well, how the constant threat of violence and instability that characterized this period could be contained. The philosophers traveled between courts, offering their ideas to rulers who were desperate for any advantage. Some were embraced, some were ignored, some were executed. The 100 schools of thought, as historians call this period of intellectual ferment, was not a comfortable academic seminar. It was a competition conducted under conditions of genuine danger, in a world where the wrong answer, or the wrong patron, could end your life. And underneath all of this philosophical energy, underneath all of this political violence, underneath all of this commerce and craft and ritual and daily struggle, there was the constant fact of war. Not war as a distant event reported in the news. War as something that arrived at the edge of your field. War as the sound of drums in the night. War as the requisition of your grain and your sons for someone else's campaign. The Warring States period is named for a reason. Between 475 BCE and 221 BCE, the 7 major kingdoms fought each other in hundreds of campaigns. The scale of these conflicts was staggering. Armies of hundreds of thousands of men clashed in battles that could last for days. The state of Qin, in one particularly horrifying engagement, is said to have buried alive 400,000 captured soldiers from the state of Zhao after the Battle of Changping around 260 BCE. A number that may be exaggerated, but that points to a reality of industrial-scale military violence that permanently scarred the populations of the affected regions. The development of military technology in this period was rapid and relentless because survival depended on it. Iron weapons began replacing bronze, making armies both cheaper to equip and more lethal. The crossbow, a Chinese invention of enormous military significance, allowed relatively untrained soldiers to deploy lethal force at a distance, which changed the calculus of warfare dramatically. Cavalry, borrowed and adapted from the nomadic peoples of the north, gave commanders mobile striking power that chariot-based armies couldn't match. Siege warfare became a specialized discipline, with engineers developing battering rams, scaling ladders, tunneling techniques, and devices for dropping stones and fire on attackers. The walls of cities grew taller and thicker in response, and the construction of those walls consumed the labor of thousands of conscripted workers who did not get to choose whether they participated. For ordinary people, the passage of armies was catastrophic. An army on the move ate everything in its path, not out of cruelty, necessarily, but out of necessity. Feeding hundreds of thousands of men across weeks or months of campaign required stripping the countryside of food that local populations needed to survive. Historians have found evidence that some of the worst famines of this period coincided precisely with the passage of large armies through agricultural regions. Crops were taken before harvest, animals were slaughtered, wells were contaminated or deliberately destroyed. Villages that happened to sit between two opposing forces could be destroyed twice, once by each side. And then there were the refugees, the people who fled ahead of advancing armies, carrying what they could, abandoning what they couldn't. Ancient texts occasionally glimpse these streams of displaced people, families moving along roads toward cities whose gates might or might not open to them, toward territories controlled by kingdoms that might or might not be willing to absorb them. The refugees of ancient China are almost invisible in the historical record because history was written by and for the powerful. But they were there, in enormous numbers, and their displacement reshaped the demography and culture of entire regions. It's worth dwelling on what it meant to be a soldier in this world, because the armies of the warring states were not professional forces in the modern sense. They were composed primarily of conscripted farmers. A man who had spent his life learning the seasonal rhythms of his fields, when to plant, when to irrigate, when to harvest, was handed a spear or a crossbow and marched hundreds of miles to fight in a conflict whose strategic logic he probably couldn't follow and wasn't required to understand. The military manuals of this period, and we have several, most famously The Art of War attributed to Sun Tzu, though also texts like the Wuzi and the Six Secret Teachings, were written for commanders, not for the soldiers they commanded. The soldier was a resource to be deployed. His job was to follow orders, to hold formation, to advance or retreat on command, to die if that was what the formation required. The casualty rates of this period's major battles were horrific. Men died from wounds, from disease, from exposure, from starvation when supply lines failed. Men who survived battles sometimes died on the march home from infections that had no treatment. Prisoners of war were sometimes enslaved, sometimes executed en masse, sometimes ransomed back to their families if their families had anything worth paying. The lucky ones came home. They came back to fields that might have been stripped bare in their absence, to families that had struggled without them, to communities that had been reorganized by the state to maximize agricultural output and military readiness, because states in this period were becoming increasingly sophisticated in their management of populations. This is one of the underappreciated developments of the Warring States period. The invention of bureaucracy, of systematic state administration, as a tool for survival in an intensely competitive environment. The state of Qin, which would ultimately win the competition and create the first unified Chinese empire, was particularly aggressive in developing these administrative tools. The Qin reforms, implemented most dramatically by the minister Shang Yang in the 4th century BCE, systematically dismantled the old aristocratic order and replaced it with a centralized state apparatus that could extract resources and military service from the population with unprecedented efficiency. Land was redistributed. The old noble families were stripped of hereditary privileges that could not be justified by service to the state. Men were promoted or demoted based on military achievement, specifically on the number of enemy heads they took in battle, which gives you some sense of how the system's values were structured, what Shangyang was building, and what the rulers of Qin embraced with terrifying enthusiasm was the idea that the state existed to maximize power, and that people existed to serve the state, not because the people's well-being didn't matter, but because the well-being of the people was best achieved by making the state as strong as possible. This is the core of legalist philosophy applied to governance, and it worked. Qin grew stronger, more organized, more militarily effective with each generation, and as the other kingdoms failed to match this organizational efficiency, the gap between Qin and everyone else slowly, inexorably widened. For ordinary people inside Qin, this meant a life that was in some ways more secure. The legal system was clear, punishments were consistent, and the state actively worked to expand agricultural production, and in other ways, more controlled than anything their grandparents had known. The mutual surveillance system meant that your neighbors were officially responsible for reporting your illegal activities, which created communities bound together by shared anxiety as much as by genuine solidarity. The abolition of hereditary privilege meant that theoretical social mobility existed. A farmer's son could rise through military service. But it also meant that the old social networks that had protected communities from the worst abuses of power were dissolving. The other kingdoms watched Qin with a mixture of fear, contempt, and reluctant admiration. Confucian scholars particularly were horrified by what they saw as Qin's rejection of the ritual and virtue that held civilization together. They argued that a state based purely on law and punishment, without the moral cultivation of its ruler and officials, was a kind of barbarism. Efficient perhaps, but soulless. That debate, between law and virtue, between efficiency and humanity, between the power of the state and the dignity of the individual, was not resolved by Qin's victory. It has never been resolved. It echoes through every subsequent period of Chinese history, and through the political arguments of our own time. What was it like, though, in those final decades before unification, to be a person living in one of the kingdoms that Qin was steadily absorbing? What did it feel like when the news arrived, and news traveled slowly by messenger and rumor, and the reports of merchants on the roads, that another city had fallen, that another army had been defeated, that another king had sued for peace? In the kingdom of Chu, which was vast and ancient and culturally distinct in ways that made its people feel different from the northerners in profound ways, there were poets and scholars who looked at what was happening and wrote about it. The great poet Qu Yuan, who served the king of Chu and was ultimately exiled when his warnings went unheeded, wrote laments that are still read today. The Li Sao, the Songs of the South, in which the loss of what Chu was becoming is palpable, is personal, is devastating. Qu Yuan drowned himself in the Miluo River when Chu fell to Qin. That event is commemorated every year in the Dragon Boat Festival. A reminder that embedded in one of China's most beloved celebrations is the memory of a man who chose death over the destruction of his world. But Qu Yuan was famous, educated, connected to the court. What about the farmer outside the city walls? What about the merchant whose trading routes were being disrupted by the advancing Qin army? What about the woman watching her husband march away to fight, knowing that the odds were not good? We don't have their words. We have the traces of their lives in excavated objects, in the tools found in their graves, in the simple clay pots that held their offerings to the dead, in the bamboo strips recording legal cases, tax records, administrative reports. These documents tell us that people in this period worried about the same things that people have always worried about. They worried about debt. They worried about illness. They worried about their children's futures. They disputed property lines with neighbors. They complained about officials who exceeded their authority. They asked the diviners for advice and hoped the ancestors were listening. And then the world changed. In 221 BCE, after decades of steady conquest, the king of Qin defeated the last remaining independent kingdom and declared himself the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, of a new, unified empire. He standardized the writing system, so that people across the vast territory could now communicate in writing even if their spoken dialects were mutually incomprehensible. He standardized weights and measures so that commerce could operate across a common framework. He built roads, the great imperial highway system that radiated from the capital like spokes from a wheel, allowing armies and officials and news to move with unprecedented speed. He built the first version of what would eventually become the Great Wall, using conscripted labor on a scale that was almost unimaginable, under conditions that killed enormous numbers of workers. He burned books, particularly the texts of the Confucian tradition, which he saw as a threat to his authority. And he buried alive hundreds of scholars who continued to teach forbidden ideas. He was, by any measure, one of the most powerful and most brutal rulers in human history. But here is what the history books struggle to fully capture. For the people who had lived through the Warring States period, the unification was not simply a political event. It was a transformation of reality. The local lord who had governed their valley for generations, gone, replaced by an official appointed from the capital. The local gods, the local ceremonies, the local calendar systems, some retained, others modified, others simply abandoned as the Qin state imposed its own standardized religious and administrative frameworks. The currency that their fathers had used, melted down, replaced with the Qin standard coin. The local laws under which disputes had been resolved, replaced by the unified Qin legal code. Everything that had been local became imperial. Everything that had been particular became general. Everything that had been alive with the specific character of a specific place and a specific people was now enrolled in a single vast system designed above all to function, to be efficient, to extract the maximum from the land and the people, and to deploy it in the service of the emperor's vision. There were people who welcomed this, farmers who had been caught between warring kingdoms, who had watched their crops burned and their sons conscripted over and over for a generation, who simply wanted peace. They may well have felt relief. The Qin state did bring peace, or something close to it, within its borders. The roads were safer. The markets were more predictable. The legal system, while harsh, was at least consistent. But there were also people who experienced the unification as a kind of death. The aristocrats of the old kingdoms who lost their lands, their titles, their place in a world they had understood. The scholars who had built their identities around the specific literary and philosophical traditions of their kingdoms, now forbidden or devalued. The communities that had organized their ritual life around local traditions that the new empire didn't recognize. The merchants who had built their networks along the old trade routes, now disrupted by new imperial priorities. History remembers Qin Shi Huang. It remembers his tomb with its army of terracotta soldiers, each one individually crafted, each one standing guard over a buried world. That tomb, sealed, vast, said to contain rivers of mercury flowing in the shapes of China's great waterways, is itself a kind of monument to the disappearance of the world that came before it. The emperor built himself a universe to take with him into death, a universe organized entirely around himself, because he had abolished the one that existed before. What was lost in that abolition was not only kingdoms, it was ways of being human, specific dialects that faded as the standardized written language spread. Local musical traditions that no one thought to preserve because they seemed simply local, simply normal, not yet precious. Particular foods, particular ceremonies, particular ways of greeting your neighbors that were tied to specific places and specific social systems that the empire reorganized. The people who carried these things inside them, who knew the old songs, who remembered the old lord's face, who could tell you exactly which spirit lived in the bend of the river 2 miles past the willow tree. Those people died, and when they died, so did what they knew. This is always how it works. History moves, and people carry what they can, and the rest stays behind. The world before China was one empire was not perfect. It was violent, stratified, precarious, often cruel in the casual way that worlds organized by absolute hierarchy are always cruel. But it was alive in a way that is worth trying to see clearly. worth trying to understand, not because we can or should want to return to it, but because the people who lived in it were fully human, as complicated, as searching, as scared and hopeful and ordinary as anyone alive today. They never knew they were living in history. They never knew that what they called their world would one day be called the Warring States period, would be described in books and documentary films, would be excavated by archaeologists and argued over by historians. They only knew the smell of millet in the morning, the weight of the harvest basket, the face of the ancestor on the shrine shelf, the sound of bronze bells from the manor on the hill. And then that world ended, as all worlds do, eventually, not with understanding, but with the simple fact of its ending. The next question, the one that opens the door to everything that followed, is stranger still. What happened inside the first imperial palace, in the years when one man tried to hold together what had always been many, and found that empires, like people, carry inside them the seeds of their own transformation? That story begins where this one ends.